Okay, so at the end of that last video for 5, I didn't really talk about the aftermath very much, so I thought it fit in really well with 6. Alright, so after the American Revolution, began with people changing their ideas, changing their beliefs, their sentiments. Republican ideology is going to be a major theme. No more aristocracy, no more monarchy, a big fear of not being ruled by a king or a tyrant. Instead, this Republican nation where citizens are equal before the law and governed by elected representatives. Government should protect those rights, basically all the things that were their complaints before the revolution ever started. State constitutions are the place where political experiments are going to start. They start at the state level with written constitutions. They have governments with governors, senates. They have a separation of powers within them. Executive branch being the governor, judicial branch, which is the courts, and a legislative branch, which is the elected assemblies or the senates. Most of them have a Bill of Rights, limiting power of government, increasing the power of legislative, protecting people's rights, included as part of it. The Articles of Confederation was the first constitution. Continental Congress decided to basically put a permanent framework to the government, legalizing what was already in practice, basically. The Congress is going to become the Confederation Congress, which served as the executive branch, and a collective replacement for the monarchy. They were able to conduct foreign powers, disputes between states. They had authority over coinage, postal service, and Indian affairs. But there was no court system, no federal court system that was handled within the states, no power to enforce resolutions, no power to levy taxes. To approve war had to be a 9 out of 13 vote for approving war. For treaties, coinage, finances, army, and navy required a majority. It had to be unanimous to pass for taxes and amendments. What was happening within society is that people had focusing on the revolution, liberty, equality, democracy being the theme, and yet there was a glaring inequality among the people that were left. For the Loyalists, it was one of the most significant post-revolutionary changes. The Loyalists, many of them very well-to-do citizens, they lost their property, they were assaulted, brutalized, some even executed, and really that was happening on both sides. But many of them are going to flee and leave. Some of them went to Britain, but they weren't really looked on as equals there either, and so many of them will go to Canada instead. There's limits within equality. The spirit of independence became the spirit of equality, lowering property qualifications to vote, electing office, a lot of their representatives coming from the common people. But there's a lot of inconsistencies. The idea of slavery, meaning people were saying, okay, so you've fought for rights and you fought for equality, but really all you meant was equality for whites and white men at that. There's a lot of people that were fighting to get rid of slavery then to start the new nation without slavery, but the southern states would never have agreed to join the country at that point. So in the spirit of preserving the country and trying to just push that battle to another day, they gave in on allowing slavery within the new country. Women as well were championing for their equality during the revolution. They knew opportunities. They would handle supplies. They were cooks, nurses. Some even fought in place of their husbands. Some even disguised themselves as men and fought in their place. Abigail Adams, when John Adams was going to have the goal of forming the government, she said, "Remember the ladies," meaning don't forget about us and include us within your political rights. Republican motherhood is basically the phrase for the expectation for women at that time, and that was just to stay home, to raise a family, and was limited to that and only that. For Native Americans during the Revolution, most of them had remained neutral. Some fought for the British, some fought for the Americans. But there's a lot of chaos on the frontiers, very gruesome fighting. Promises were made to respect them and their land, and at the end of the war, a lot of those things were forgotten. For religion, separation of church and state was a theme and became a practice. 1776, the Virginia Declaration of Rights guaranteed the free exercise of religion and separated church and state, not allowing taxes to support the church any longer. Okay, so going into chapter 6 then, now that they have made the articles and have declared their independence, the Articles of Confederation are going to be like I said, the first Constitution. There's a fear of central government being too dominant at this point. They want to reject the older ways of doing things, aristocracy, social class division, and want it to be more of an equal status, especially for those in the lower end of the classes. The Confederation, right out of the Revolution, Congress of the Confederation had very little government authority. Pretty much all authority was given to Congress. They could ask for money, but they couldn't make anybody pay anything. They could enter treaties, but not enforce anything. They could raise armies, but not really ask or require people to fill those spots within the armies. Anything really of substance had to be a unanimous vote. And getting these 13 colonies, now states, to vote unanimously is going to be near to impossible. Accomplishments that it did have is it wraps up the Treaty of Paris. It created the first executive departments. A lot of the principles for land distribution, territorial government, those ordinances in the West are going to be the biggest significance and win for the Articles of Confederation. And in 1781, Congress will begin to set up the three departments: foreign affairs, finance, and war. So there are some early developments within the government that they were successful at. But in terms of creating a lasting and functioning government system, that's just not going to work for the Articles of Confederation. For finance, Robert Morris was kind of the leader of the executive leader of the Confederation, not the president by any means, but he was a significant person involved. He wanted to make the Confederation government more powerful, thought of a taxation program, because really a government that can't raise taxes, it can't raise money, can't pay its debts, and that's just going to cause a lot of problems. So debt management was a big focus early on, and one of the places where people saw some of the need early. Morris decided that to issue new government bonds to help pay off the wartime debt, secured a charter for the Bank of North America, which would hold government cash, lend money to the government, issue currency, but all of that was depending on secure income for the government, and that's just really not going to happen. Soldiers were trying to get their pay promised to them from the Revolution. And even the Newburgh Conspiracy, trying to basically stage a coup, was ended by a Washington speech, getting them to calm down, getting them to back off. Hamilton had tried to get endorsement from George Washington, but the Congress owed a lot of money to the soldiers, to the citizens, and the debt was just growing. In terms of land policy, this is really where the most long-lasting success from the Articles is going to come from. Congress had really hoped that a lot of income for the government could come from the sale of western lands. Now that the West was open and people were able to migrate, Jefferson helps to write the first one, the Land Ordinance of 1784. When the population of land reached that of the smallest existing state at the time, it could achieve statehood. So trying to prompt people to bring in more people to settle. Actually, I'm going to add that real quick. Okay, so the Land Ordinance of 1784, that was Jefferson basically trying to set up a model for statehood. Land Ordinance of 1785 is going to outline a plan for land surveys and sales, basically a grid pattern for how they could be divided up and sold, making sure that each section was sold for no less than $1 per acre, and reserving some of the funds towards schools, which really was a new thing because schools really didn't have that much of a focus at this point. For the Northwest Ordinance, kind of backing off Jefferson's plan a little bit, but this is going to outline that territories could fall subject to a governor, secretary, and those would be appointed by Congress until they reach a certain number, and then they would be able to elect their own. Once they had set that up, they'd have a Bill of Rights, legislative representation, trial by jury, a lot of outlines for how to become a state, basically, and just how to develop that territory into a state later on. And a lot of these, basically with this ordinance, it's going to exclude slavery from the Northwest. Basically the Mason-Dixon line is going to be the split north-south slavery and non-slavery states. Little different from the old royal colonies, but by having some condition for how they could become independent on their own. So looking for the Northwest Ordinance, just kind of how it's structured, everything, we kind of talked about that in the last slide, but looking at just how it's set up, territories to become states, and just kind of the organization of all of it, And then, of course, with the Native Americans, there was some tension. As settlement was accelerating, population is growing. The Native Americans they really didn't have a way to fight a lot of these settlers moving onto land or closer to their land. There's two treaties, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, where the Iroquois were forced to give land in western New York and Pennsylvania, and then the Treaty of Hopewell, where the Cherokees gave up all claims really in South Carolina, western North Carolina, and the areas now in Kentucky and Tennessee. So really pushing those Native Americans farther and farther off their land. For trade and economy, Congress had very little to do with the achievements in the economy, but could really looking at kind of the results of the war and separation from Britain, and really the ones that were suffering are farmers and merchants. Farmers, their commercial agriculture was dependent on trade with foreign markets, and when it's really on a downturn, that was really hurting their profit. For the merchants, they were cut off from a lot of the mercantile system, trying to find new places to trade and to buy things from. Those who had financed both sides and privateers were benefiting. There's a lot of sentiment for free trade. Adam Smith, 1776, Wealth of Nations was published, and trying to reason and go through the idea of Wealth of Nations with supply and demand, and seeing a very quick cycle of post-war boom and bust coming in the economy. They were excluded from trade in the West Indies. Americans were, so they're looking for new places. A lot of treaties were made with the Dutch, Swedes, Prussians, Moroccans, trying to find new places to trade in Europe, Asia, Africa, open up trade with China. So the economy is starting to improve very gradually. Merchants have more ships, there's more exports. They just had to slowly start to grow into their own with all of that. With diplomacy, there's a lot of problems still with the British and the Spanish and the military outposts, and still some occupation of the British. The confiscation of Loyalist land after the Revolution was a real sore spot between the British and the Americans. The boundaries between the Americans and the Spanish, there's a lot of navigation, and then the Mississippi River is going to be one of those targets when it came to expansion, land, and who had control of what. Problems that came with the Articles of Confederation is the fact that it just didn't have any central power. State governments really did not have the ability to respond to anything, whether that was taxes, money, trade regulation, really just inefficient in terms of what they were able to get across there. Around 1785, the demand for paper money was a big part of this too, wanting people to pay their debts, but not having hard currency is a problem before the Revolution, during, and after the Revolution, is just not having access to that hard currency. So paper money was a big demand. Debtors are going to demand paper money being circulated. 7 states actually began issuing paper money as a way of extending credit to farmers who really needed those loans to pay their mortgages, to pay off some of the veterans. But some states are going to be really inefficient in managing that paper money. So in response to these problems with paper money, plus some of the states charging too much and taxing too much, Shays' Rebellion is going to be the first major conflict for the new government to respond to. Shays' Rebellion was a bunch of farmers who were fighting and rose up against the taxes, having too much taxation and too little paper money, too little money in general circulating around to pay off those debts. And led by Daniel Shays, he was a war veteran, seeking a more flexible money policy, the right to postpone paying taxes until the economic depression in the country was fixed. The state responded by sending their militia. The revolt was pretty successful, though, because it did result in the legislature in Massachusetts backing down on some of those direct taxes for a year, lowering some fees, lowering and fixing the debt process, because it wasn't uncommon either if you couldn't pay your debts that they would throw you in debtor's prison. And so people were seeing this as extremely unfair. They were demanding payment for debts, yet there was no way to pay off those debts. So the call for stronger government comes out of Shays' Rebellion. When the government really couldn't respond with a national force, people started seeing that they needed a stronger government, not only for military response, but also somebody to manage the money and the trade, interstate commerce, tax policy, paper money, whatever the case might be. And so that stronger government It's going to happen at the Annapolis Convention. They get together and they decide to fix the problems. Really, their goal was to fix the Articles of Confederation. They did not go into it with the intention of rewriting it, but that's going to be what's going to end up happening. And that's end of part 1.